Welcome to Cable Co-op's Newswatch. Bilingual education, is this an issue you know very much about? Well, there's some very important things about to happen in that field, and believe it or not, they've all begun here in Palo Alto. So stay with us and we'll talk about just that, bilingual education. You're watching Cable Co-op's Newswatch. Our subject is bilingual education, and I didn't mean for my intro to send you running down to 25 Churchill to see what our school board is doing about the kids in this town here. It's a statewide issue, but a very important thing is happening that began here with the gentleman that's our guest today, Mr. Ron Unz of Palo Alto, who is the man behind Proposition 227, which will be on the ballot this June, and I was going to explain it as this is something which will eliminate bilingual education in California. And I think you probably would like to respond to that statement.
Well, it wouldn't completely eliminate bilingual education or outlaw it. What it would allow is those parents who want bilingual education for their children could apply for a waiver to have their children placed or kept in a bilingual program. But for the overwhelming majority of the children right now in bilingual education, they would be shifted over to programs of intense English immersion, sheltered immersion, to teach them English as soon as they start school instead.
Okay, well, Mr. Unz, let me first, you got into your answer so fast I didn't have a chance to thank you for joining us, and I do appreciate it. I should mention that Mr. Unz is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur in the financial software field, and as I mentioned, he is a Palo Alto resident. He was a candidate for governor not very long ago, and is Republican in background, so that should cover your background pretty well. Let's get into this issue, and let's start in a very simple place. Why are you so involved in this issue? What's driving Ron Unz here?
Well, I've been interested in the issue of bilingual education for many, many years, at least 10 or 15 or 20 years. I come from a little bit of an immigrant background myself. For example, my mother, even though she was born in Los Angeles, grew up not speaking a word of English. She spoke her family's language at home, and then her parents taught her a little bit of English right before she started school, and then once she started kindergarten, she learned English very quickly and easily, and actually ended up graduating college with a degree in English literature. So I've always been very skeptical of why bilingual education was necessary and why children who don't know English shouldn't just be taught English as soon as they start school. But the origins of this particular initiative campaign came in 1996 when I read a series of articles in Los Angeles Times describing how a group of immigrant Latino parents in downtown Los Angeles actually had to begin a public boycott of their local elementary school because the school refused to teach their children English. Now, that seemed very strange to me.
It's a pretty strong statement. The school refused to teach their children English.
That's why it got a lot of attention. I mean, in fact, it made it into some of the national media.
Was that the sort of thing that just triggered you and said, this makes me, I'm just damn mad, won't take it anymore, and you wanted to do something about it?
Well, I mean, it made me want to investigate the story to see whether it was really true or not, because it seemed like a very strange story. In other words, I'd always thought of bilingual education as being a failure. But when it reaches the point where parents have to carry picket signs outside their local school because it refuses to teach English, it seemed to have gone over to the realm of insanity. So when I had some time and I was down in Los Angeles, I met with some of the parents involved in the boycott and also met with the local immigrant rights activist who was working with them just to find out whether the stories were true or not. And it turned out they were all completely true, and many of the worst aspects of the current system hadn't even gotten into the press.
Was this something that happened, just to get a context, before or after your campaign for governor?
Oh, it was afterwards, a couple of years afterwards.
So it wasn't a component of that race then?
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, even during my campaign, and long before then, I at times read articles in the paper about groups of Latino parents protesting bilingual education, but none of them had really gotten the attention of that particular boycott in Los Angeles in 1996.
Well, if we can then, in brief form, if you will, because our time is limited, what exactly will happen if Prop 227 is passed? What will be the structural change in our schools with regard to the teaching of language?
Sure. What the initiative would say is that when children start school in California, if they don't already know English, they would normally be put in an intensive, sheltered English immersion program to teach them English as quickly as possible. And then once they learned English, after generally a year or less, they'd be moved into a regular class with all the other children.
So is this built into the initiative that these special programs for non-English speaking students would be put in place by our school?
Oh, exactly.
System? This would be mandated on the school system.
Right, exactly.
So it's not a case of, at least as I've heard it presented, that you just simply eliminate it and the kids are on their own. You'd put some structure in place and that would be mandated.
Oh, exactly. In other words, the way it would work is those parents who really wanted their children in a bilingual program could apply for a waiver to have their children placed or kept in a bilingual program. But for all the other children who didn't know English, they would just be put in these intensive, sheltered English immersion classes to teach them English as quickly as possible.
So it sounds like our schools would still be in the business under this proposition of teaching in languages other than English.
Well, I mean, to some extent. In other words, obviously,
on a parallel path is the way it sounds from the way you describe it.
Right. I mean, the thing is, for those parents, and probably would be only a fraction of them, that wanted bilingual education, those programs would continue. Obviously, foreign language programs would continue in the normal way in the public schools. And for example, well, I mean, there are some English-speaking children whose parents want them in special Chinese immersion programs or Spanish
those are like
electives,
though. I'm thinking of the mainstream education in the schools.
Sure.
Would be English-based in the system.
Exactly.
And that if you want to have teaching in Spanish or Tagalog or one of the other languages, that would be a parallel path for the students. They'd still have to attend the other classes as well, or would they start out in their language path and then move over as soon as they're proficient?
Well, you would move over, but these English immersion classes are taught in English. In other words, they're not taught in the child's native language. Now, they can use some of the child's native language, but the overwhelming majority of the instruction is in English. So in other words, these programs would teach children English by teaching them in English, as opposed to bilingual education, which really, to be perfectly honest, is more of a form of Spanish-only instruction with almost no English being taught.
You've put a couple things on the table there. Let's pursue the Spanish-only first.
Sure.
It sounds, again, from your statement that you feel that the motivation for bilingual education as it currently exists is the Hispanic community. It's the Spanish language issue.
No, not really. In other words, most Hispanic parents don't like bilingual education. According to all the public opinion polls, there's overwhelming support for our initiative to get rid of it. But on the other hand, the majority of the children in bilingual programs today are from a Spanish language background. For example, in California, of the children who don't know English in the public schools, 80% speak Spanish. And the next largest group after that are Vietnamese-speaking children, who are 3%. So it is overwhelmingly a Spanish language issue.
Yet it is also true, I think, and I have some personal experience in this. For example, I do some work in the city of Daly City, and we actually did some materials for them that had to be in 4 languages. And in addition to English, they were Tagalog, Spanish, and Mandarin.
Sure.
So there are different patterns in different communities.
Oh, exactly.
And given that, and I know, for example, that over in the East Bay, Union City has a very heavy Filipino community, so
Sure.
you're back to the Tagalog again. Isn't it appropriate that communities be able to set up programs that reflect the kind of ethnic base that they have within that community?
Right. But you see, the thing is, since the goal of bilingual education is really to teach the children English, and since it doesn't work, and let me just give you a couple of the statistics on it, because what had happened after I met with those parents was I investigated the statewide statistics on these programs, and they're unbelievably dreadful, much worse than I ever imagined.
Statistics in terms of?
In terms of language acquisition for limited English children in California. For example, in the state right now, and these are the official government statistics from the Office of Bilingual Instruction, 1/4 of all the children in California public schools don't know English. So it's a lot higher than a lot of people realize. And of the ones who don't know English, each year only 5 or 6% learn English. In other words, 95% of the children who start a given school year not knowing English end that school year still not knowing English, which is amazing.
The implication I could draw from what you just said is that we have children going through a system which has bilingual education
Exactly.
in place right now that are coming out the other end of the system undereducated. Is that correct?
Oh, tremendously.
That's your
Tremendously. I mean, the numbers are unbelievable. For example, in Los Angeles, the LA Unified School District just completed a study focusing on students who'd started a bilingual program in kindergarten, and after 6 years in the program, over 2/3 of them had not learned enough English to even take a test in English.
But they're still getting classes in their language.
Right, it's all in Spanish. You see, again, the term bilingual education really is a misnomer, because for most of the students in California who are in bilingual programs, the program really is a Spanish-only program. There's almost no English being taught. And that's one reason they don't learn English, because it's hard to learn a language if you're not being taught the language.
I have so many things I want to explore in this. Let me take you back to the mechanics of the thing, and then we can end up and talk some more about how this will work. I think there's some really interesting questions here. But I want to come back to the process of this thing being on the ballot. Clearly, for those of you watching this show, there's a lot to be learned about this, and I hope you will use this as a trigger to do your own self-education, as I will. But you've used the initiative process to move this forward. Why not go through the normal legislative process in this state?
You've raised a very good point. In fact, when I first began this campaign, a lot of people said, well, why didn't you try to do something through the state legislature? You've got to understand the law governing bilingual education in California expired 11 years ago. And for 11 straight years, the state legislature has been deadlocked on the issue of either renewing the law or modifying it or reforming it or doing something about it. So in other words, the State Department of Education has continued for 11 straight years to vigorously enforce an expired state law.
Did you try going through your legislative representatives to get some action on that?
No, it's completely impossible. In other words, you know, if they'd been deadlocked for 11 straight years...
So you just looked at the playing field and said, this is a no-win game, I'm going to the initiative process.
Exactly, because after 11 years of deadlock, I don't think one person like me coming in from the side would have changed them.
Well, one could argue, and there's a parallel here that intrigues me, and that is that many years ago, some people looked at the issue of property taxes, decided the legislature was never going to act on it. They passed a thing called Prop 13, which, well-intended though it may have been, had some very unhappy consequences, including for the schools. Don't you worry about something that doesn't go through the legislative process, like your initiative, having some unintended consequences that could be detrimental?
Well, to be perfectly honest, the legislative process seems many times to have even bigger problems than any other process. In other words, the legislation it produces tends to be very poorly designed also. And in this case, again, the law expired 11 years ago.
Of course, the difference is that that's easier to fix than things that go into the Constitution.
Well, our initiative is not part of the Constitution.
Okay,
it's a statutory initiative.
So that makes it easy to fix then?
It makes it easier to fix. In other words, our initiative could be modified by a 2/3 vote of the state legislature. So it would take a little bit more than a majority. But it certainly isn't written into the Constitution.
If we have time, I'll ask you about 2/3 rules as well. But you said you've used the phrase "our" a couple of times.
All right.
Who besides Ron Unz is behind this?
Well, I mean, what had really happened is I met with, again, the parents and local immigrant rights activists, and I talked with a lot of other people I know on the issue. Together, I probably played the largest role in drafting the initiative, but I talked and discussed it over with a lot of other people, got them involved, and then recruited other people to help in the campaign. So, for example, the honorary chairman of our campaign is Jaime Escalante, the world-famous East LA calculus teacher who's been fighting bilingual education for many, many years. The co-proponent on the initiative, the co-chairman of the campaign, is Gloria Mata-Tuckman, who's a first-grade teacher down in Santa Ana, who's been fighting bilingual education for many, many years. And so these are all people involved in the campaign with me, along with others.
Yeah, but now you did say, again, I'm trying to pick up your words carefully here, the implication is that you or a very narrow group of people drafted this legislation. Let's be specific. Who did draft the legislation we'll be voting on?
Well, I drafted the core of it, and then I circulated around 15 separate drafts to probably about 40 or 50 different individuals around the country to get their input. And then, again, the drafting went through about 15 different versions of the initiative, getting feedback.
But there's been no public meetings or public discussion or discourse on it. The campaign provides that.
Exactly.
So that if something has been missed by those who might have some opposition to it, they're going to have to go back to that 2/3 vote in the legislature if it passes.
Right. But nothing has really come up during the whole campaign. So in other words, and by the way, when I circulated around the drafts of the initiative, I circulated to some of the leading supporters of bilingual education in the country whom I met with.
And you got comments from them?
Oh, yes, exactly.
And did any of those comments get into your drafting?
Well, actually, they didn't give me comments on the actual drafting of the initiative, even though I, had asked for them. I mean, they really just said that even though they felt bilingual education didn't really work well, they thought it might be made to work in the future, and so they hoped I wouldn't go ahead with the initiative to get rid of it.
Well, it sounds like you are going to go ahead, and we're going to go ahead and take a break right now. We'll be back in just a moment with more on bilingual education in California. You're watching Cable Co-op's Newswatch. Our subject is bilingual education in California. Our guest is Mr. Ron Unz, a Palo Alton who is the driving force behind Prop 227, which will make some, I'll say this time, significant changes in bilingual education, or how we teach our children of different languages in this state. We talked, as we're going to our break, we talked about the campaign and who's behind it, and let me just ask this much more about that aspect of it. When you went out to qualify this initiative for the ballot, who paid for that?
Okay, well, I put in probably over half of all the money myself, and I talked to various friends of mine and persuaded them to put in money as well. But overall, this is a very popular issue, and this initiative really, I think, will take less money to qualify and win than almost any other initiative in California history.
Well, you've already qualified it, so it's a case of it being on the ballot. But now let's talk about the campaign.
Sure.
Again, I hope to get to this question in a little broader sense, but we are experiencing in contemporary politics these days what people of considerable means can do to impact the political system with their own money.
Sure.
And you were a person of some success and means, and therefore are in that position to do that where others may not be. Here's a campaign that is going to have an effect on people at the most basic level, their children. Is it going to be a campaign in its favor financed by those people, or is it going to be financed by a few people with a lot of means?
Well, to be perfectly honest, this is a very cheap campaign, and I don't think there's going to be that much money spent one way or the other. I mean, to give you an example.
You think you can run a cheap campaign statewide in California? I'm amazed
at that statement. I've only spent a few $100,000, and I mean, the whole campaign, I think, is going to be one of the least expensive.
Does that include, excuse me, but that includes qualifying it? That seems
sure,
very cheap to me to qualify.
Like I said, it's a very cheap campaign. And the other side doesn't have much money either. They'll probably spend a couple $1 million. So, I mean, this is not, the thing you've got to understand is this is the sort of issue most people feel fairly strongly about. And it's gotten a lot of coverage in the press. So, for example, according to the last poll that came out, the field poll, more people were familiar with this initiative by far than any of the candidates for governor, even though Checky had spent $18 million already. And we had more support in the most recent field poll among the people of California than all 4 candidates for governor combined.
That's because nobody can spell Checky or pronounce it.
Or Harmon, or Lundgren, or
any of the others, that's right.
So I'm not, maybe it's the candidates being weak, but I mean, we have more support among the people of California than all 4 candidates for governor combined.
Does that suggest then that during the course of your signature gathering campaign that was easy to do, that you had a good response?
Oh, very strong response. In fact, most people seem to say, and we had organized signature gathering and volunteer signature gathering. But most people...
And that was, I presume, had to be financed in some way.
Oh, exactly. And that's where, a few $100,000 was spent. But again, that's very little for an initiative campaign. And overall, most people seem to say this was one of the easiest initiatives to get signatures for that any of them had ever encountered.
I have to ask you this question because obviously we're going into campaign season, so
sure.
We're going to be hearing a lot about it. You mentioned that the people against it, by the way, who are the people against it? Let's ask that question.
It's mostly the bilingual education industry, because now...
There's an industry?
Oh, yeah, very much, because, I mean, right now the state of California, nobody knows how much is being spent on these programs.
Who comprises this industry?
Well, the bilingual coordinators and the bilingual administrators and the bilingual teachers and the bilingual academics.
So you're saying people whose salary depends on having bilingual programs?
Yeah.
But wouldn't they have, in the construct that you described earlier, wouldn't they have a role in educating children through these other mechanisms?
Well, some of them would and some of them wouldn't. In other words, their jobs would certainly change, and people are reluctant to put their jobs at risk, even if their jobs might not really disappear. We're talking about a system right now that nobody knows how much money is spent in California, but if you're looking at the extra cost above and beyond the regular cost of educating children, the extra cost of educating limited English children in these programs, it's probably close to $2 billion a year. And
that's actually a question I wanted to ask you from our first half, and too much to ask you about in too little time. Have you done an analysis that takes a look at the kinds of programs that would result if this legislation passes, as against what we have today, and try to get some sense, and again, this is where legislative process is probably going to be helpful, but get some sense of what the net cost difference is between the way we do it today and the way it would be done under the system that you propose?
Well, it's a difficult thing to prove, and conclusively.
Give me a ballpark. What is your sense of it?
Well, I mean, I would say probably this initiative will save, a few $100 million a year, maybe $1 billion a year.
Even though it does require other kinds of special programs to be put in place.
But here's the difference. You see, if you put children in an intensive, sheltered English immersion program, you teach them English, and then once they learn English, they're transitioned into regular classes. Under the current system of native language instruction, where they're taught only in their language, or almost only in their language for many years, they stay in these special programs, sometimes for 6 years or 8 years or even 10 years. So in other words, the time they stay in these special programs where they're not being taught English is much longer, and that's the reason that...
So as a former engineer, I can say that the area under the curve is smaller, is what you're saying.
Oh, exactly. And so overall, it probably would save, I don't know, $1 billion a year, something like that.
Well, that's the subject, an answer that may come back to haunt you, or it may turn out to be your finest campaign
nobody
position.
knows.
One more question about the children that are involved. One can imagine very young children, first graders, coming in, they learn quickly, and they can learn a, quote, new language quickly if they're immigrant children. But what about the children that are 8th graders and 9th graders and so on, that have lived with a foreign language for a long time, and all of a sudden they're right in the middle of this system that's running pell-mell?
You've raised a very good point. I'd like to say that if you're talking about older children, children who are 12 or 13 or 14, I think you can make a very reasonable case in favor of bilingual education.
Well, how's that going to work if this passes?
Well, because then those children, in our initiative, children who are 10 and older would have a much easier time getting a waiver to have their parents place them in a bilingual program as opposed to an English-oriented program. But the interesting thing you said about younger children comes in two ways. First of all, almost all the children who don't know English in California public schools began in the schools here when they were 5 or 6 years old, in kindergarten or the first grade. In fact, over half of them were born right here in California. So they started school with all the other children in their neighborhood. The reason they're still classified as not knowing English in the teens is because they haven't been taught English for all the years they've been in school, which is a very strange policy.
Well, back to these older kids.
Sure.
Your legislation, I gather, provides through this waiver process for an easier, presumably easier process for them to not have to deal with the program as it's set up. But what I'm concerned about, does it again provide for some clear mechanisms so that children of that age group can get the special attention that they need?
Well, I mean, most immigrants that I've talked with think that even at that age, it's better if they intensively concentrate on learning English. But if their parents feel otherwise, the parents could simply go down to the school and apply for a waiver to have the children placed in a bilingual-oriented program.
But what if there is no bilingual program?
Well, if enough parents...
Unless it's mandated by the legislation, then the school may not offer it.
Right. What the initiative says is that if at least 20 children of a given grade level have their parents get a waiver to be in a bilingual program, the school has to offer it.
So that's the mandating aspect that I was fishing for.
Right. If it's less than 20, then the school has to allow them to transfer to another school, like a magnet school that does have a bilingual program.
So the danger would be for districts that are small, where the numbers of children in these categories are small, and the next school is a long distance away. So there may be some people who get caught in the dilemma of not being able to find a program.
There's actually a lot of evidence that even for older children, bilingual education isn't as good as as English language instruction. But the other thing you should be aware of, which is one of the strange things about bilingual education, the bilingual academics that designed and supported these programs actually believe that the older you are, the easier it is to learn another language. And so they say that young children have the hardest time learning a new language, while adults or teenagers have an easier time. And that's the reason they support bilingual education.
It seems counterintuitive.
It doesn't make any sense at all. And it's contradicted by all the scientific data, but that's what they believe.
We've talked about a lot of specific details here that relate to the program that you're talking about. You're about to embark upon a campaign, and you made a comment earlier about as people learn about the initiative. One of the difficulties of political campaigns, and I trust you would agree regardless of the subject, is that it's very hard in the emotion of a campaign, and this is one that could fall into that category very easily, for people to get the real hardcore facts about what it will do and what it won't do, because it gets emotionalized. There'll be things that have to do with race, there'll be things that have to do with charges of racism, all kinds of things will be floating around before we're done here. How well informed do you think you can make people, at least of your position, in the course of this campaign?
Well, I think people are fairly well informed already. In fact, the funny thing about the campaign is that even though our opposition is funded by the bilingual education industry, in all their materials and debate presentations and presumably in their advertising campaign, they're trying to avoid the issue of bilingual education at all costs.
Well, what are they saying?
Well, they say that, bilingual education may not work, or we don't want to defend bilingual education, but we think this initiative is the wrong way to go. And really, they're just making up distortions about what the initiative says in order to try to frighten people.
Give an example of a distortion.
Well, I mean, one thing they say, for example, is that the initiative would force schools to mix together children of different ages, which is just utterly false. And another thing they say is that teachers could be sued for speaking another language other than English, which again is just utterly false. In fact, one of the sheets we distribute with our materials, and we also have up on our website, is called Falsehoods and Facts about Proposition 227. And again, the other side in their campaign literature that they give to their supporters urges their supporters to avoid the subject of bilingual education at all costs. In other words, they don't want to defend bilingual education because it's indefensible. It just doesn't work. We've been trying it for 30 years, and it's never worked in all that time.
When will the formal campaign start?
Well, I mean, really, the campaign is going on right now. It's been going on for all this time. It's 2 months before the election.
And will you be doing the usual TV and all of that?
We'll be doing some of it.
That gets expensive, regardless of your comment previously.
We'll be doing some of it, but I really don't think we have to do all that much. In fact, the main focus of our advertising probably will be the Spanish language media. Because right now we're ahead almost 4-to-1 among everybody in California, which is a gigantic lead. While on the other hand, among Hispanics, we're only ahead by 2-to-1. So in other words, there's more of a chance that we could lose ground among Hispanics in California. And since they're the ones most affected by bilingual education, we'll probably concentrate most of our advertising efforts in the Spanish language media.
Let's assume for a moment that you are successful with this venture. What's the next political step for Ron Unz?
Well, I mean, actually, one thing I've come across is a lot of other things that probably should be fixed through the initiative process in California. And maybe I'll get involved in other things like that.
Are you planning to run for office again?
Oh, I might.
And you mentioned the initiative process, and we said off camera that I'm not a big fan of doing government that way. Why not? Are you going to try the legislature first on some of these new ideas?
I really think the legislature never pretty much gets anything done in a typical year. I mean, for example, a lot of these issues hang around for 10 or 20 years, and during all that time, pretty much they all just sit around and talk, and nothing ever gets done.
But doesn't the initiative process, even though it may be valid in this particular example that we were talking about, ultimately just undercut the whole idea of representative government?
Well, I mean, if representative government were more effective, probably people wouldn't turn to the initiative process. But again, in the case of bilingual education, we have a gigantic program that doesn't work, that nobody wants, and that is based on a law which expired 11 years ago.
Well, perhaps I should encourage you to make your next issue, instead of going to another initiative, let's find a way to make government work better the way it's supposed to in the halls of the legislature. But as we wind down the show, I want to thank Mr. Unz for being our guest and for sharing a lot of his ideas with us. If you want information, he has a website, and I understand you even have the opposition's reference on your website, which I think is very magnanimous of you. Nothing you can't do with a large poll lead. But find out about the issue. It is important. It's going to affect the children of California and their future. Do something about it. Next week on Newswatch, the religious right. So we'll have some fun there too. Stay with us, and we'll see you next week.